For 7 years, a little boy lived in complete silence. 7 years of doctors, 7 years of specialists flown in from 3 continents, each one paid enough to buy a house, and every single one of them said the same tired sentence: "There's nothing more we can do." His father was a billionaire. He had more money than most small countries. He could buy anything on earth except the one thing he actually wanted, which was to hear his son say a single word. And then a woman came to clean his floors. No degree hanging on a wall, no white coat, just a mop, a bucket, and a secret she'd been carrying her whole life. One quiet afternoon, that little boy looked up and caught her doing something with her hands that no adult had ever done in front of him. Something so simple, something so shocking to a child who had spent his whole life being talked about instead of talked to, that he dropped what he was holding and just stared. What she did next cracked open a case 7 years of experts had gotten completely wrong, and by the time the truth came out, the man at the top of that mansion was on his knees. Before we go any further, do me a favor. Tap that subscribe button, hit the like, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from right now. I've got a feeling this story landed in front of you today for a reason, and I want to know who's here with me. All right, let me take you to the top of a cliff on the coast of Maine, to a house where nobody laughed anymore. The estate was called Ravenscliff, and it sat on the edge of the Atlantic like it was daring the ocean to come take it. 40 rooms, a private drive that curled for half a mile through black pines, floor-to-ceiling windows that turned gold every evening when the sun went down over the water. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place people put on postcards, the kind of place you drive past and think, whoever lives there must have everything. But if you ever got inside those walls, the first thing you'd notice wasn't the marble or the chandeliers. It was the quiet, not a calm quiet, not the peaceful hush of a house at rest. This was a held-breath kind of quiet, the kind that sits on your chest. The staff had learned to move through the halls without making a sound. No radios in the kitchen, no television murmuring in the sitting rooms. No one hummed while they worked. Somewhere along the way, an unspoken rule had settled over the whole house, and the rule was simple: keep it silent. He prefers it silent. The he was Julian Ashford, 44 years old, built an empire moving cargo across oceans, ports, and container ships and shipping lanes his family had owned for 3 generations. Fortune magazine had run his face on the cover twice. He'd shaken hands with senators. He'd bought companies over breakfast the way other men buy coffee. And he spent most of his nights alone in a study on the 2nd floor, staring at a painting of a woman who wasn't alive anymore. Her name was Eleanor. She died when their son was 3, taken by a cancer that moved so fast the best oncologists money could find never got ahead of it. One spring, she was planting tulips along the drive. By autumn, Julian was standing at a graveside in a black suit, holding a boy who couldn't hear a single word of the prayers being read. Because that was the other thing about the Ashford house. The boy, Eli Ashford, had been born deaf. Profoundly, the doctors said. Congenital, they said. He had come into the world in perfect health in every other way. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a shock of dark hair just like his mother's, and a silence around him that no machine had ever been able to break. So Julian had 2 griefs living in his chest, and they had grown so tangled together over the years that he could no longer tell them apart. He'd lost the woman he loved, and he was losing his son a different way, a little every day, watching Eli drift further into a world Julian could not enter and did not understand. He had tried to buy his way in. God, he had tried. There was a folder in his desk drawer 3 inches thick, and every page of it was a receipt for hope. Boston, Zurich, a clinic outside Tokyo that only took referrals, a research team in London that charged $40,000 just to review the file before they'd agree to see the boy in person. Julian had said yes to all of it. He'd chartered jets. He'd rented apartments in foreign cities so Eli would have somewhere quiet to recover between appointments. He'd sat in 100 waiting rooms with his hands folded, waiting for someone, anyone, to walk out and tell him something other than the sentence he'd come to hate. "We're very sorry, Mr. Ashford. There's nothing more we can do." He'd stopped believing that sentence around year 4. Then he'd stopped believing in the doctors around year 5. By year 7, if you want the honest truth, Julian Ashford had mostly stopped believing in anything at all. He loved his son. Understand that. Everything he did, the whole exhausting machine of it, came from love. But love that has nowhere to land starts to curdle. It turns stiff. It turns into a man who buys his boy the most expensive train set in the world and then can't figure out how to sit on the floor and play with him. A man who kisses his son good night and walks out of the room before he has to watch those small hands try to shape a question he'll never be able to answer. Eli had a whole vocabulary of signs by then. His tutors had taught him. But Julian had never learned more than a handful. He always meant to. There was always a merger, a crisis, a call from Singapore at 2 in the morning. He told himself he'd learn next month, next quarter, when things calmed down. Things never calmed down. And a boy grows up fast when nobody's talking to him. That was the house Marisol Reyes walked into on a cold Tuesday in November. She had no idea what she was stepping into. All she knew was that she needed the job, and she needed it badly. Marisol was 29, and she'd been awake since 4 that morning. She'd taken the bus up from Portland, then a second bus, then walked the last mile and a half up the coast road with the wind coming off the water hard enough to make her eyes sting. By the time she reached the iron gates of Ravenscliff, her hands were red, and her good shoes were soaked through. And she stood there for a second, just looking up at the house, thinking one thought over and over. Please, please let this one work out. Back in Portland, she had a mother, Gloria, 61 years old, and her kidneys had quit on her 2 winters ago. Now Gloria spent 3 mornings a week hooked to a dialysis machine, and the bills for that machine had a way of arriving faster than Marisol could pay them. She'd been juggling 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night and a diner shift on weekends, and it still wasn't enough. The letter from the clinic had come the week before. Balance past due. Please contact billing to avoid disruption of services. Disruption of services. That was the polite way of saying they'd stop keeping her mother alive if the money didn't show up. So when the placement agency called about a live-in domestic position at a private estate, good pay, meals included, Marisol had said yes before she even heard the details. She didn't care whose house it was. She didn't care about the fancy address. She needed the paycheck, and this paycheck was bigger than anything she'd seen in years. The head of the household staff met her at the service entrance. His name was Gerald Voss, and he'd run Ravenscliff for 11 years. Tall, gray, precise as a bank clerk. He looked at Marisol's wet shoes for exactly 1 second longer than was polite. "You're the new one," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. Marisol Reyes." "Mr. Voss is fine." He turned and started walking, expecting her to follow, which she did. "Some things you need to understand before you set foot past this hallway. This is not an ordinary household. You'll clean the rooms you're assigned, and you'll do it well. You will not wander. You will not take photographs. You will not discuss anything you see here with anyone outside these walls." He paused at a corner and looked back at her. "And you will keep away from the boy." Marisol blinked. "The boy?" "Mr. Ashford's son, Eli. He's 7. Something crossed Voss's face then, something that might have been sadness if he'd let it stay long enough. "He's deaf. He's had a difficult life, and Mr. Ashford is very protective. The staff does not interact with him beyond what's necessary. We had a girl last spring who thought she'd befriend him, brought him little presents, sat with him. He straightened a picture frame on the wall that didn't need straightening. She lasted 9 days. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Yes, Mr. Voss. Good. Clean the floors. Fold the linens. Stay invisible. Do that, and this can be a very good position for you. He handed her a folded uniform and a schedule. Your quarters are on the 3rd floor east wing. Breakfast is at 6. Don't be late and don't be seen. She spent the first week doing exactly what she was told. She learned the geography of the place, which staircases the staff used and which ones they didn't. She learned that the housekeeper before her had left the copper polish in the wrong cabinet. She learned that Julian Ashford was almost never home, and when he was, the whole house seemed to lower its voice another notch. She kept her head down. She was good at that. Life had taught her early how to make herself small in a room. But you can't make yourself blind. And by the 4th day, Marisol had started to notice the boy. She saw Eli for the first time in the conservatory, a big glass room on the south side of the house full of plants and light. He was sitting on the tile floor with his back to her, and he had a row of little wooden animals lined up in front of him, a lion, an elephant, a bear, arranged in the most careful straight line you ever saw. He wasn't playing with them exactly. He was just looking at them, ordering them, moving one a half inch to the left so it lined up perfectly with the others. He didn't turn around when she came in. Of course he didn't. He couldn't hear her. Marisol stood in the doorway with her cleaning cart, and she felt something in her chest go very still, because she knew that posture. She knew those shoulders, hunched up around the ears, like the boy was bracing for a world that kept surprising him from behind. She'd seen it before, a long time ago, on someone she'd loved more than anyone. She'd had a brother. His name was Teo, and he'd been born deaf too. 4 years younger than her, and from the time Marisol was 6 years old, she had been Teo's bridge to the hearing world. She learned to sign before she learned to ride a bike. When the doctors talked over Teo's head, she was the one who knelt down and told him what they'd said. When kids on their block made fun of the sounds he made, she was the one who stood in front of him with her fists up. She'd spent her whole childhood as her little brother's voice, and it had wired something into her that never came out. Teo was 30 now. He taught art at a school for the deaf outside of Providence. He had a wife, a beat-up truck, and a laugh you could feel across a room even though you couldn't hear it. He was, in every way that mattered, one of the most alive people Marisol had ever known. So when she looked at Eli Ashford sitting alone on that cold tile floor, hunched and silent and lining up wooden animals in a house full of servants who'd been ordered not to talk to him, she didn't see a tragedy. She didn't see a boy who couldn't be reached. She saw a locked door, and she happened to have spent her whole life holding the key. Stay invisible, Voss had said. Keep away from the boy. She backed out of the conservatory that first day and went and cleaned the library instead. She needed this job. Her mother's life depended on this job. She wasn't about to throw it away over a feeling. But she started watching. She couldn't help it. She watched Eli press his hand flat against the cold glass of the big windows and stare out at the ocean for an hour at a time, the way you'd watch a television show. She watched him flinch, just slightly, whenever someone walked into his line of sight without warning, because a person who can't hear you coming lives their whole life getting startled. She watched him at dinner, alone at a long table, while a staff member set a plate in front of him and left without a single gesture, and she watched the way his eyes followed that person out of the room, hungry, like he was hoping this time somebody might stay, and she watched him do one thing that stopped her cold. It was the 4th evening. Marisol was dusting the baseboards in the main hall when the old grandfather clock by the staircase began to chime 7 o'clock. Deep, heavy bell tones you felt in the floorboards. Eli was across the hall on the bottom stair, and when that clock struck, he went still. Then he did something strange. He got up, crossed to the clock, and pressed his small hand flat against the wooden case while it rang, his eyes half closed, his whole body leaning into it. He couldn't hear it. Everyone knew he couldn't hear it, but he could feel it, and he was drinking that feeling in like a man in a desert finding water. Marisol stood there in the dark hall with her dust cloth in her hand, and a thought slid into her mind and would not leave. A small, dangerous, impossible thought. What if he can feel more than they think? What if nobody ever really checked? She pushed it away. She wasn't a doctor. She was the maid. What did she know? But the thought had teeth, and over the next 2 weeks it wouldn't stop biting. Here is where everything turned. This is the moment the whole story hangs on, so let me slow all the way down and tell it to you exactly the way it happened. It was a gray afternoon near the end of Marisol's second week. Rain was coming in hard off the water, drumming on the glass roof of the conservatory. Julian was away in New York. Voss had driven into town for supplies. The house was as empty as it ever got. Marisol was mopping the conservatory floor. She thought the room was empty. It wasn't. Eli was tucked into a corner behind a big fern, so quiet she hadn't seen him, and he was doing something that made her set down her mop and forget all about it. He had a glass of orange juice on the tile beside him, and he had a picture book open on his lap, and he was trying to tell the story to himself. His little hands were moving. He was signing to no one, making the shapes his tutors had taught him, telling the tale of the pictures to an audience that didn't exist because there was nobody in his life who spoke back. And then his elbow knocked the glass. It went over. Orange juice everywhere, and the glass rolled and cracked against the tile, and Eli's face crumpled the way a child's face does right before the tears come, that particular panic of I broke something, now I'm going to be in trouble, and I can't even hear how much trouble I'm in. Marisol crossed the room before she'd decided to. She dropped to her knees on the wet floor right in front of him, and she did the only thing that had ever made sense to her in a moment like this. She didn't reach for the glass. She didn't scold. She lifted her hands, and she signed. Are you okay? Don't worry. It's just juice. We'll clean it up together. Fluent. Fast. Easy. The way you speak a language you've known since you were 6 years old. Eli froze. I want you to really picture this boy for a second. 7 years old. A whole life of adults looming over him and moving their mouths at shapes he couldn't catch. A whole life of being handed things and led places and talked about in rooms he was standing right in the middle of. He had tutors who signed at him during lessons, sure, like homework. But no adult, not one, had ever knelt down in the middle of an ordinary spilled juice afternoon and just talked to him, in his language, like it was nothing. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. His mouth fell open. His eyes went huge. He looked at Marisol's hands, then at her face, then back at her hands, like he was trying to make sure he hadn't imagined it. Then, very slowly, with hands that shook a little, this boy who thought he was the only person in the world who lived inside a silence, lifted his fingers and signed one word back. You? Just that. You? Like, you can do this? You understand me? You, of all the people in this cold house. You? Marisol felt her throat close up. She nodded, and she signed back. Me. I understand you. I hear everything you're saying. And Eli Ashford burst into tears. Not sad tears. The other kind. The kind that come out of a person when a door they'd given up on suddenly swings open. He launched himself off the floor and into her arms and held on, this small stranger's boy, gripping the front of her uniform, like she might disappear if he let go, crying into her shoulder while the rain hammered the glass overhead. Marisol held him. Orange juice soaking into the knees of her uniform, broken glass a foot away, and she held that little boy and rubbed his back and let him cry it all out. 7 years of it. And she said the only thing there was to say, over and over, with her hand pressed flat between his shoulder blades so he could feel the rhythm of it. I've got you. I've got you. I've got you. That was the shocking thing he saw. Not a miracle cure. Not a machine. A pair of hands that spoke his language from a woman who was supposed to be invisible. And from that afternoon on, nothing in that house was ever the same. They became a team of two, and they kept it quiet because they both understood without ever saying so that if the wrong person found out, it would end. Every day, Marisol found little ways to be near him. She'd bring her cart to whatever room he was in and clean slowly. And while she cleaned, they talked. She learned that Eli's favorite color was the exact blue the ocean turned right before a storm. She learned that he wanted, more than anything in the world, to be a person who fixed things, an engineer, though he didn't know that word yet, so he just signed it as a man who makes broken things work. She learned that he thought about his mother a lot, even though he barely remembered her, and that nobody in the house ever talked about Eleanor, so all his questions about her just piled up inside him with nowhere to go. She started answering them. Everything Julian had been too heartbroken to give his son, this stranger gave him for free, one signed conversation at a time. She told him his mother had planted the tulips along the drive. She didn't actually know that. She'd overheard a gardener mention it. But, she told Eli, and the way his whole face lit up, you'd have thought she'd handed him the moon. And the more they talked, the more Marisol noticed things that didn't add up. She noticed that when the foghorn sounded out on the point, low and long, Eli's head turned toward it. Not always, but sometimes. And a boy who is profoundly, completely deaf should not turn toward a foghorn. She noticed that when she vacuumed, he liked to stand near the machine and put his hands on the housing to feel the motor, and that once, when the pitch of the motor changed as she switched settings, his eyes widened like he'd noticed the change, not just felt it. She noticed that he loved the old upright piano in the music room, a piano nobody ever played, and that he'd sit on the bench and press the lowest keys, the big booming bass ones, over and over, and press his ear right down against the wood while he did it. Not the high keys, the low ones. Always the low ones. Marisol had grown up around deaf people her whole life. She knew that deaf isn't one single thing. She knew there's a whole spectrum, that some people have residual hearing in certain frequencies, that a person can be completely cut off from high sounds and speech while still catching the deep, low rumble of the world. She knew that if you test a frightened little kid the wrong way, or the same lazy way, every single time, you can miss it. And she started to wonder, lying awake in her narrow bed on the 3rd floor, whether that was exactly what had happened to Eli Ashford. 7 years. Millions of dollars, the finest clinics on earth. And she wondered if a single one of them had ever gotten down on the floor with this scared little boy, gained his trust, and really tested what he could feel in the low end, or whether they'd all just done the same expensive scan, gotten the same result, collected their fee, and repeated the sentence Julian paid so much to keep hearing. There's nothing more we can do. It was an insane thought. She was a housekeeper. She had no right to it. But she'd had a brother, and her brother, at 9 years old, had been told by a doctor he'd never be able to do anything with sound at all. And that doctor had been wrong. Teo had gotten a second opinion, and then a third, and, eventually, a cochlear implant. And the first day they switched it on, Teo had heard birds and cried like a baby and signed they were here the whole time, over and over. Marisol had watched that happen with her own eyes. She knew what a wrong answer, repeated confidently by expensive men, could cost a child. So she made a decision that could get her arrested, could get her fired, could get her mother thrown off dialysis. She decided to find out the truth. She almost got away with it. Almost. Her plan was simple, and it wasn't reckless, whatever anybody later tried to say. She wasn't going to touch that boy medically. She wasn't a fool. What she was going to do was find out whether there was any record, anywhere, of anyone ever properly testing his low-frequency hearing, and if there wasn't, she was going to find a way to make that testing happen through the right people. But first, she needed to understand what had actually been done. And that meant getting Eli to tell her. Over a week of quiet afternoons, she coaxed the whole history out of him in signs, the way you'd draw a splinter out slow. And a strange picture came into focus. Eli remembered doctors, lots of them. He remembered the cold gel they put behind his ear and the buttons they stuck to his head. He remembered a nice lady doctor once, a long time ago, who'd made him laugh, and who'd put something in his hands that buzzed, and who'd been excited about something. And then Eli signed. That lady doctor went away and never came back, and after that it was always the same tall man with the gray beard who came to the house, the man his father trusted, and that man never made him laugh at all. The tall man with the gray beard. Marisol knew who that was. Everyone at Ravenscliff knew Dr. Prentice. He was the family's private physician on a hefty annual retainer, the man who coordinated Eli's care, who arranged the specialists and reviewed the files and sat with Julian in the study afterward with grave eyes and told him what all the reports meant. A nice lady doctor who got excited and then vanished, and then the gray-bearded man on retainer forever after. Marisol's stomach turned over. She didn't have proof of anything. But she had a shape now, and it was an ugly shape. That was the afternoon Voss caught them. She and Eli were in the music room. She'd been teaching him a game, tapping rhythms on the piano lid, high taps and low taps, watching which ones he could feel, keeping mental notes. Eli was laughing, that silent, open-mouthed laugh, delighted, when the door opened and Gerald Voss stood in it, and the temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. "Step away from him," Voss said. Marisol stood up slowly. Eli looked between the two adults, and even a 7-year-old could read that face. He signed, fast and frightened. "Don't be mad at her. Don't be mad." But of course, Voss didn't understand a word of it. "I warned you," Voss said, his voice low and shaking with something that wasn't quite anger. "On your first day, I told you to keep away from that child. Mr. Voss, please, if you'd just let me explain." "There is nothing to explain. You disobeyed a direct instruction." He stepped into the room. "Do you have any idea what you're playing with? That boy is the only thing that man has left in the world. And you, a stranger, a temp from an agency, decided you knew better than 7 years of the finest doctors on the planet?" "I don't think I know better than doctors," Marisol said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "I think somebody's lied to those doctors, or lied to Mr. Ashford about what the doctors found. And I think this boy can feel more than anyone in this house has ever bothered to check." For 1 second, 1 single second, something flickered across Gerald Voss's stern face. Because in 11 years he had watched a great deal in this house. And maybe some part of him had wondered the same thing, late at night, and pushed it down the same way everyone here pushed everything down. Then his face closed again like a door. "Pack your things," he said quietly. "You're finished here. I'll have your final pay sent to the agency. Mr. Ashford returns tomorrow evening. I want you gone before then." And he turned and walked out, and Eli ran to the window and pressed both hands against the glass and cried. And Marisol stood in the middle of the music room with her whole plan in ruins, and her mother's dialysis bill flashing behind her eyes. And she thought, "What have I done?" She didn't sleep. Of course she didn't. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed on the 3rd floor with her bag half packed on the floor, and she did the math, the terrible math. No job meant no paycheck. No paycheck meant the clinic letter came true. She thought about her mother's face, the way Gloria always tried to smile through the fatigue on dialysis days, the way she'd say, "Don't you worry about me, Mija," in a voice that was worried about everything. She could still leave quietly. Take the pay Voss offered, get back on the bus in the morning, get another job somewhere, protect her mother, keep her head down like the world had always taught her to. Nobody would blame her. Nobody would even know. And then she thought about Eli's hands. You understand me." She thought about her brother at 9, told he'd never do anything with sound. She thought about the birds Teo cried over. She thought about a nice lady doctor who got excited about something and then disappeared, and a boy who turned his head toward foghorns, and 7 years of the same confident sentence from the same men getting paid to say it. Somewhere down the hall, in the big cold silence of that house, a little boy was going to wake up tomorrow and find out his one friend in the world had vanished overnight without saying goodbye. Just like the nice lady doctor. Just like everyone. Marisol Reyes had spent her whole life making herself small, getting through the door quietly, not causing trouble, surviving. And somewhere around 3 in the morning she got up off that bed, and she decided she was done being quiet. She wasn't going to sneak the boy off to some doctor. She wasn't going to do anything reckless. She was going to do the one thing nobody in 7 years had been brave enough to do, and she was going to do it out loud to the man's face and let the chips fall. She was going to wait for Julian Ashford to come home, and she was going to make a billionaire listen to his maid. She got out a piece of paper. She started writing down everything, every observation, the foghorn, the piano, the low keys, always the low keys, the grandfather clock and the vibration he leaned into, the buttons behind his ear he remembered, the lady doctor who got excited and vanished, the gray-bearded man on retainer who came forever after. She wrote it all down in her small, careful handwriting, and by the time the sky over the Atlantic started going pale, she had 4 pages. She didn't know it, but 3 floors below her, in a quiet clinic file room in Boston that nobody had opened in 5 years, those 4 pages were about to be proven right. Julian Ashford's helicopter set down on the pad behind Ravenscliffe at 6:40 the next evening, and Gerald Voss met him on the lawn to walk him inside, already talking, already smoothing things over. "A small staffing matter, sir. Nothing for you to trouble yourself with. The new housekeeper overstepped. I've already dismissed her. She'll be gone within the hour." Overstepped how? Julian was barely listening, thumbing through messages on his phone, exhausted, the way he always was. She'd been interacting with Master Eli, against instruction. Julian's thumb stopped. He looked up. Interacting. Spending time with him, playing games. I put a stop to it the moment I... Where is she? That was when Marisol came out the front door. She should have been intimidated. This was one of the most powerful men in the country, standing on his own lawn with the ocean roaring behind him and a helicopter blade still turning down. And she was a soaked pair of shoes and a borrowed uniform and 4 handwritten pages folded in her pocket. But she'd made her decision in the dark, and she walked straight up to him before Voss could stop her, and she said the thing she'd rehearsed all night. "Mr. Ashford, my name is Marisol Reyes, and before you send me away, I need 90 seconds of your time, because I think your son can hear, and I think somebody's been lying to you about it for years." The lawn went dead silent. Even Voss went white. Julian Ashford looked at this woman the way you'd look at someone who'd walked up and slapped you. "Get her off my property," he said low. "Sir, now." 2 staff started toward her, and Marisol, who had been shrinking away from rooms her whole life, planted her feet and did not shrink. "He turns his head toward the foghorn," she said, fast, loud, because she had seconds. "A profoundly deaf child doesn't do that. He presses his hands on the piano and only ever plays the low keys because those are the ones he can feel, and maybe more than feel. He leans into the grandfather when it chimes. He remembers a doctor, years ago, a woman, who got excited about something and then never came back, and after that it was only ever your Dr. Prentice, the one on your payroll, forever. I'm not a doctor, Mr. Ashford. I clean your floors. But I grew up with a deaf brother who was told the exact same thing your son was told, and he was wrong, and my brother hears birds now. 90 seconds. That's all I'm asking then, and I'll get in the car." The staff had her by the arms. Julian stood there in the wind, And something in Marisol's face, the sheer certainty of it, the fact that she was risking everything to stand on his lawn and say this to his face, reached him in a place 7 years of grave-eyed specialists never had. "Stop," he said. The staff let go. He stared at her a long moment. Then, very quietly, "You said a woman doctor. Got excited. What did she get excited about?" "Eli says she put something in his hands that buzzed, and she was happy about it. And then she was gone." Julian's face changed, because he remembered her. It came back to him all at once, a young audiologist from years ago, before Prentice had streamlined the care, a bright, hopeful woman who'd wanted to run more tests, and who'd been let go for reasons Julian had never fully understood at the time. Prentice had handled it. Prentice handled everything. Julian Ashford turned to Gerald Voss. "Don't send her anywhere," he said. "Get Prentice's files, all of them, and get me the name of every doctor who's ever seen my son." It took 9 days. Julian did not do anything the cheap way, ever, and he didn't do this the cheap way either. He hired an independent pediatric audiology team out of Boston, people with no connection to Prentice, no connection to any of the old clinics, and he had them start from zero. New tests. The right tests. The patient careful, get down on the floor and earn his trust kind of tests. And he had Marisol in the room for every single one, because Eli wouldn't do any of it without her, and because somewhere in those 9 days Julian had stopped thinking of her as the maid. And while the new doctors tested the boy, a lawyer and 2 forensic accountants went through 7 years of Prentice's files. Here's what came out. Nearly 5 years earlier, that bright young audiologist, the lady doctor who got excited, had run a low-frequency test on a 4-year-old Eli and gotten a result that lit her up. He had significant residual hearing in the low frequencies. More than that, her report flagged him as a strong candidate for a cochlear implant, a device that could, in the right ear at the right age, open up the entire world of sound. She had written it clearly, in plain language, at the top of the page. Recommend urgent implant evaluation. Window for best outcome is closing with age. Do not delay. That report had a date, and it had a signature, and it had, stapled behind it, a second document that made Julian Ashford put his hand over his mouth. A memo from Dr. Alan Prentice to the audiologist's clinic, thanking them for their work and informing them their services would no longer be required, recommending, in careful language, that the premature implant recommendation be set aside pending further longitudinal observation, and, the accountants found, in the same month, Prentice's retainer with the Ashford estate had quietly renewed at a higher figure with a new line item: ongoing specialist care coordination. Chronic case. Chronic, meaning ongoing, meaning forever, meaning a case that never resolves is a case that never stops paying. The implant recommendation had never reached Julian. Prentice had buried it. For 5 years he had steered a grieving, guilt-ridden father toward an endless parade of expensive, inconclusive foreign consultations, each one confirming the diagnosis that kept the money flowing, each one ending in the same sentence Julian had come to accept as gospel. And the whole time, sitting in a file drawer in Boston, there had been a green light, a door, a way out for a little boy, dated when that boy was 4 years old and his hearing pathways were young enough to make the most of it. Julian read that memo standing up in his study, and then he had to sit down because his legs stopped working. 7 years, all those flights, all those waiting rooms. All those nights he'd stood in his son's doorway and grieved a silence that a machine could have broken half a lifetime ago. He had thrown a fortune at his son's ears and never once thought to ask the one question that mattered, because he'd trusted the man in the gray beard, and the man in the gray beard had figured out that Julian Ashford's guilt was the most reliable income stream he'd ever have. And the person who'd finally asked the question? She wasn't in the file. She had no letters after her name. She'd found the answer on her hands and knees on his conservatory floor, in a language he'd never bothered to learn, and she'd nearly been thrown off his property for it. The new audiology team confirmed everything. Eli was, at 7, still a strong candidate. Later than ideal, thanks to 5 stolen years, but the door was open. Julian didn't hesitate for even a second. Best surgical team in the country. Everything Eli needed, and this time, everything he needed was the right thing. The surgery went cleanly. Then came the wait, a few weeks for healing before the day they'd switch it on. Activation Day, the audiologist called it, the day the world would come in for the first time. They did it in a small quiet room in the hospital in Boston. Eli sat in a chair. His father knelt on one side of him. Marisol knelt on the other, because there was no way on earth this was happening without her, and Eli held one of each of their hands so tight his knuckles were white. The audiologist, a kind woman who reminded Marisol a little of the doctor Prentice had chased away, worked at a laptop. "All right, Eli," she said, and Marisol signed it as she spoke. "I'm going to turn it on very softly. It might feel strange. It might not sound like anything you expect. That's completely normal. Ready?" Eli looked at Marisol. She nodded and signed. "I'm right here. Whatever happens, I'm right here." The audiologist tapped a key. For a moment, nothing. Eli's brow furrowed. Then he flinched, just slightly, and his eyes went wide, and he looked around the room like it had suddenly filled with ghosts. Because it had, in a way. It had filled with the hum of the air conditioning, and the tap of the woman's fingers on the keys, and the sound of his own breath, a whole invisible world that had been there his entire life and that he had never known existed. The audiologist leaned in close and spoke, soft and clear. "Eli, can you hear my voice?" And Marisol didn't sign it this time. She held her breath instead. Eli's head turned, toward the sound, toward the voice, and his face did something none of them would ever forget. It cracked open into pure astonishment, the same face her brother Teo had made 20 years before, the face of a person discovering that the world had been singing the whole time and nobody had told him. He started to cry, and then he did the thing that put every adult in that room on the floor. He turned to Julian. He'd never heard his father's voice, not once in 7 years. He didn't know what it sounded like, but he knew somehow, in the way children know things, that the man kneeling beside him with tears streaming down his face was the source of a sound he'd been feeling his whole life without hearing. Eli opened his mouth. His voice came out rough and strange and unpracticed, a voice that had never made a word before because it had never had a reason to. "Da," he tried. Then again. "Dad." Julian Ashford, worth more money than a small nation, a man who had shaken hands with senators and bought companies over breakfast, folded completely in half and pulled his son into his chest and sobbed, and Eli grabbed fistfuls of his father's shirt and said it again, testing it, tasting it. "Dad, Dad, Dad," each one steadier than the last, and Julian said, I'm here, I've got you, I'm here," into his son's hair. And it didn't matter anymore whether the boy could catch every word, because, for the first time, in both their lives they were talking, out loud, and the room was full of the sound of it. Marisol stood up quietly and stepped back toward the door, the way she always did, making herself small, letting the family have their moment. She didn't get far. Eli's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, and he looked up at her, tears and snot and the widest smile in the history of the world, and he pointed at her, and then he pointed at his own ear, the ear that could hear now, and he signed, with those hands that had spoken to her across the silence that first rainy afternoon. You did this. You heard me first. There was a reckoning, of course. There's always a reckoning. Dr. Alan Prentice did not walk away clean. Julian's lawyers made sure of it, and it turned out the Ashford case was not the only family Prentice had turned into a chronic annuity. That's all I'll say about him, because men like that end up as footnotes, and this was never really his story. Gerald Voss kept his job, though he was a changed man about it. He was the one who came to Marisol weeks later, stiff and formal and unable quite to meet her eye, and said, "I owe you an apology. I nearly put you in that car myself. I've wondered every day since, what would have happened to that boy if you'd gotten in it?" And Marisol, who understood by then that Voss had spent 11 years swallowing his own doubts to keep the peace, told him it was all right and mostly meant it. And Julian sat Marisol down in the study, under the painting of Eleanor, a few days after Activation Day. He looked older and younger at the same time, the way people do when a weight they'd carried for years finally comes off. And he tried to talk about money because money was the only language he'd ever really been fluent in. He named a number, a large one, a thank you, a settlement, a please let me buy back some of the years I wasted number. Marisol thought about her mother, about the dialysis bill, about how easy it would be to take the check and go home a solved woman. "My mother's on dialysis," she said. "Her kidneys failed 2 years ago. If you want to help me with that. That's real. That would change my life." She paused. "But I don't want a reward for loving your son, Mr. Ashford, because I didn't do it for a reward. I did it because I couldn't not do it. And I think you understand that now better than anybody." Julian was quiet for a while. Then he said, "My wife would have liked you." He said it plainly, the way you say something true. Eleanor was the one who talked to people. Really talked. I was always the one on the phone. He looked up at the painting. "After she died, I think I forgot how. I've been trying to fix my son from across the room for 7 years because I didn't know how to just get down on the floor and be with him. You knew. You knew that first afternoon. He handled Gloria's care. All of it. Not as a payoff, he was careful to say, but as what any decent person does when they can. The dialysis, the specialists, a spot at a good facility close to Marisol so she could see her mother whenever she wanted. Gloria got years back. Good ones. But that wasn't the real ending. The real ending was smaller and quieter than any of that. Julian Ashford started learning to sign. He was bad at it. Genuinely, comically bad at first. A grown man's stiff hands fumbling through the alphabet, getting it wrong, laughing at himself, which was a sound the house hadn't heard in years. Eli was a patient and merciless teacher. He'd correct his father's clumsy hands and roll his eyes and sign again, "Dad." Again. And Julian would do it again. And Marisol taught them both, because they asked her to stay, not as a housekeeper anymore, but as something closer to family, as the person who'd built the bridge and had no intention of walking off it. She brought Teo up to meet Eli, her brother the art teacher, 30 years old, alive as a bonfire, and the two of them, the man who'd been told at 9 he'd never do anything with sound, and the boy who'd been told the same at 4, sat on the conservatory floor for 3 hours, signing a mile a minute about airplanes and engines and everything a person can build, and Marisol stood in the doorway with the same dust cloth she'd been holding the first day, and watched, and did not feel small at all. Here's what I keep coming back to, at the end of all this. Julian Ashford had every advantage a human being can have. Money without limit. Access to the best of everything. And for 7 years, all of it pointed him at the wrong answer, because he trusted the credentials and never once thought to trust the quiet thing his own eyes could have told him if he'd only slowed down and looked. And the woman who saw it? She had nothing the world respects. No degree. No title. Wet shoes and a past-due letter and a job she was terrified of losing. What she had was a brother she'd loved enough to learn his language and a stubborn refusal to make herself small when it counted most. Sometimes the person who saves a child isn't the one you paid a fortune to find. Sometimes it's the one you almost didn't see. The one at the edge of the room. The one you told to stay invisible. Eli Ashford hears the ocean now. He hears the foghorn out on the point, all of it, not just the low rumble he used to lean into. He hears his father's terrible improving sign language jokes and laughs out loud, a real out loud laugh, in a house that used to be afraid of noise. And the first sound he ever fell in love with, he'll tell you if you ask, wasn't a sound at all. It was a pair of hands on a rainy afternoon, telling a scared little boy over a spilled glass of juice. I understand you. I hear everything you're saying. If this story moved you even a little, do me a favor before you go. Hit that like button so it reaches somebody else who needs it today. Subscribe if you're not already here, because I tell these stories every week. And tell me down in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And who's the person in your life who saw you when nobody else did? I read every single one. Take care of each other out there, and never ever assume the quiet ones have nothing to say.